and so people could hear me. Okay, I'm sorry everyone. This is Sanjeev Kagram, and we are just going to wait a few more minutes to see if anybody else joins us. We normally get started at a couple of minutes past the hour. Thank you for joining us for the second webinar for the Thunderbird Global Alumni Network. I'll introduce our alum speaker very shortly, and then we'll get started, okay? So just give us a couple of minutes and we'll get going. While we're waiting, I will mention that, Dawn Feldman just walked in. She and Kelly Kreiser have been working with many of you on alums on the alumni engagement team of Thunderbird Global Alumni Network. And if you have suggestions about future speakers for the webinar series, please just share them with her or Kelly or any of us, Petra, of course, Robin, and the team, because we want to keep these rolling. And recall that what we're trying to do is have a Thunderbird and or ASU professor, faculty member speak alternating webinars, and then have an alum speak the other on the alternate ones. And so that's why we had Mark Esposito speak at the first one, which was just last month while we were at Davos, which was so exciting. He's going to be joining us as a faculty member, which is going to be an excellent addition to all of our great people here. And then this time we have, of course, Halla Tomasdottir, who I'll introduce more specifically in a second, our alum from the class of '95. So.
And then we have also already scheduled our March webinar. I think it has gone out in the newsletter already. We have a reminder about it here, and we'll be sending the link out. That is the last Wednesday of March, and we are using one of our faculty members, Patrick Lynch, who has a great focus in the digital space, analytics, and cybersecurity. And so topic and link will be forthcoming shortly, but wanted to give you all a heads up that March is scheduled as well, and we hope you'll put it on your calendars well in advance.
Okay, well, so let's get started. So it's my pleasure and privilege, honor to introduce Halla Tomasdottir. She was class of '95, as I mentioned. She's currently CEO of the B team, which she will explain to you all a little bit more about during her remarks. She started her leadership career in corporate America, working for Mars and Pepsi-Cola. She was on the founding team of Reykjavik University, where she established the executive education department, founded and led a successful women's entrepreneurship and empowerment initiative, and was a faculty member at the business school. She was the first female CEO of the Iceland Chamber of Commerce, and later went on to co-found an investment firm with the vision to incorporate feminine values into finance. The company successfully survived the infamous economic meltdown in Iceland. In 2016, Halla was an independent candidate for the president of Iceland, and she entered a crowded field of candidates and finished as the runner-up with nearly 30% of the vote. I mean, she is one of our great alums, like all of you around the world, a true T-bird in every way. We were lucky to be reconnected as she took leadership of the B team. And we're looking forward to working with her and the B team at this point in Thunderbird 4.0 at ASU. I'm going to pass it over to Halla. I want to thank her very much for taking time in her busy schedule, all of you for joining us. It will be taped, so please share with others the link once we have it ready. And Halla's going to speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to question and discussion as we did last time. Thank you so much, Halla, and welcome.
Thank you, Sanjeev. It's such a pleasure to be with you, and thank you all for dialing in. It's really my honor to be on this call. I'm a proud T-bird of '95, and just I've said to many people, some of my best years were those years in Glendale, Arizona. And so now I live in New York, so life has taken me to lots of different places, and I thought maybe it would be interesting because the theme of the talk that I really want to give today, and I look very much forward to hearing what is top of mind for you and what questions you may have, is I want to talk about what I call the crisis of conformity and why we need a different kind of leadership, whether we're leading businesses or leading countries or wherever we are leading from. We need to start thinking very differently in the context of the world we live in today. And because I am from Iceland, and many of you may know Iceland for its infamous financial meltdown exactly 10 years ago. We all suffered a global financial crisis, but Iceland had a financial meltdown that was probably, it's called the largest financial meltdown in economic history, and that's quite an accomplishment for a very small country. But at the time, I was the co-founder and executive chair of an investment firm that we had founded just a year and a half earlier, with that interesting vision to incorporate more feminine values into finance. And as this collapse happened, we happened to be one of the few, if not the only asset manager that actually survived that meltdown. And I became as convinced as ever. I have been quite convinced that, about the kind of leadership I think the world needs for a long time. But I became really convinced at that time that we had sort of faced the shortcomings of short-termism, faced the shortcomings of what many of us learned in business school. Fortunately, at Thunderbird, we learned more than that, but the shortcomings of shareholder primacy, or short-term orientation of delivering only financial profit as business leaders. Certainly in my country, it was very devastating. Over 90% of the stock exchange over 90% of the financial sector went under, and more than 90% of the stock exchange evaporated overnight. People lost a lot of money. I know many of you lived through similar things wherever you may be in the world. But I sort of emerged from that experience in life, and I thought to myself, this must be the wake-up call that will get us to embrace a different way of doing business, a different way of leading that is more sustainable, more long-term. At the time, I heard Paul Polman speak, and that was when he had just taken over as the new CEO for Unilever. And Unilever, this large consumer products company, was struggling in the aftermath of the financial crisis like most companies were. And when he took over, he made a speech and said that he was not going to lead for the short term, that he wanted to lead Unilever with a more sustainable vision. And he was not going to report to the markets every quarter, as was the expectation at the time. I listened with a lot of attention because I was looking for where the leaders in the world would emerge after that shock that I think we all experienced. And I thought maybe all CEOs, or at least many of them, would stand up and sort of follow in Paul Polman's footstep and say, me too. I'm not going to report for the short term. I'm going to take a more of a long-term orientation to my leadership and to how I do business. But that didn't quite happen. And as a matter of fact, I really waited to hear others come forward, and that didn't really happen. And I am of the opinion that we went back to doing business as usual, which to me was never really an option. And I guess you could say that for the last 10 years, I've been on a relentless pursuit to try to talk people in the investment space, in business, and even in running for office, in embracing leadership that helps us confront what I have come to call the crisis of conformity, which to me is simply continuing to do the same thing, even when faced with the enormous challenges we do in this world. And so while I was on this journey, I came across many of the leaders who today make up the B team. And you may, and you probably all know Richard Branson, but he co-founded the B team in 2013, along with a man called Jochen Seitz, which at the time was the youngest CEO of a listed company. And the company was Puma, the sporting good company, later bought by Kering. And Jochen was a very brave young leader because he actually introduced, first of anyone that I know of, environmental accounting into the accounts of his firm. And he did a great job in turning around that company with a very different philosophy. And Richard Branson and Jochen came together along with a lot of global business leaders, many of who you will know, including Paul Polman, to who today is the chair of the B team and the person who reached out to ask me if I would come on board last year to become their CEO. But also we had leaders like Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland, Christiana Figueres, who led the Paris agreements, which and continues to be the fighter in that space. And today we have Mark Benioff, who is the CEO of Salesforce, Emmanuel Faber, the CEO of Danone, Hamdi Ulukaya, the founder and CEO of Chobani, Danone's main competitor. So B-Team is an interesting group of courageous leaders who have each in their own right become very successful, but have come together because they believe business as usual is no longer an option, and they want to advocate for a more holistic way to lead and help and really use the private sector as a driving force for the solution this world so desperately needs. And so what I want to talk about to you, and I'm happy to, when we have questions, please be unafraid to ask me any questions you have and challenge me, because I mean, I actually think it is my role here to challenge us, because I think it is time, and Thunderbird, in my opinion, has always been a very progressive school. I chose Thunderbird for that, but I think now more than ever, we really do need to transform this world. And I'm going to share with you the vision the B team has co-created as to what we think we're facing in this world today and why we need radically to transform the way we lead and do business. And so what we talk about often when we talk about the crisis of conformity is that we are in a world where we are we've been given the evidence. Scientists have told us very clearly that we are facing a climate crisis. We're facing an existential climate crisis, and we have 10 to 11 years to really do something about it. Yet we are still in the position that 40% of board directors don't think climate belongs on the boardroom agenda. This is pretty astonishing. So now we have school children marching in the streets around the world, asking us who are in leadership to hold ourselves accountable for their future. Some of them are even calling this the greatest intergenerational crime in history. Yet most businesses continue to do business the way they always have. We're also facing a crisis of inequality. We have yellow jackets in the streets, not just in France, but similar movements increasingly popping up around the world and actually driving populism and voting behavior into eroding our democracies in many places. And you know what? In France, majority of the citizens agree with the yellow jackets. 70% of people agree with the yellow jackets in the street. And what's interesting about that is that Macron, in my eyes, and I think many people would say so, is a global leader who is trying to do the right thing for climate. But somehow, I think some of his other actions didn't really make people feel like he was holding himself or the elite accountable for contributing to fixing things. So people who can't put food on their table and feel that the inequality in society is unsustainable, they're not going to get behind even when the right solutions are needed for climate. And we continue to see so much evidence on what I call the crisis of inequality. We saw just recently Amazon announcing record profits but paying no federal tax. We see pay ratios that are fueling anger in the street. One of the world's largest retailers pays its CEO 1,200 times the median pay in the company. The family earns more per minute than most employees do in a year. Make no mistake, I don't think there's anything wrong with making money, but because we have created a world that is so unequal and there's so much anger about it, all of these examples are really fueling so much anger that whether it's gender equality driving the Me Too movement or financial inequality driving a movement that is escalating fast, like the one in France, we're going to see more and more of this. And last but not least, related to some of these corporate examples I mentioned, we have a crisis of trust. At the end of last year, 3% of people in the UK trusted the government to solve the Brexit crisis. It's probably lower now, unless the most recent announcement by Jeremy Corbyn helped. I'm not sure if it did. But the interesting thing here is that while trust is low across institutions and leadership across the world, business has more trust than government right now. And most trust we see in society today is actually between employees and their employer. So in some ways, we believe, and I certainly have seen this to be the case throughout my career, that the private sector may actually be not just well positioned to influence the change we want to see, but in a position where we can't, but we have to admit that we have contributed to the way the world is right now. So I think the world increasingly expects those in private sector leadership and leaders everywhere to actually hold themselves accountable to building trust, to restoring a social contract that seems terribly broken. And it seems pretty clear that it's unsustainable to go on. So these are what we call the sort of three crises that we think all leaders really need to be aware of. And at the heart of what we are trying to do, if you take a look at those of you who can see the picture, is we think it is really time that we replace the financial economy, which has sort of held all the power of how we do things in this world, and replace it with humanity and start thinking about people and planet equally alongside of our profit pursuing journeys. And this is something that a lot of people have talked about for quite a long time. We have something called the B movement. The B team was inspired by B Lab and B Corporation movement that many of you may know. But there's about 2,700 B corporations in the world, and it's quite a strong movement in Latin America where they call it Sistema B. And these are mostly entrepreneurs and smaller companies that decide to found their company already around a triple bottom line, meaning that they are in the pursuit of profit, but they also measure and put value on their environmental, social, and governance performance, or some people call it triple bottom line, profit, people, planet. For many of you, this may not be news, but I think it's good to actually say this, because that hasn't really happened at the top of the pyramid. So large global organizations are not holding themselves accountable to that kind of a standard. But I think that's what the world is calling for. That's the system change that the school children in the street are asking for, and increasingly populations that are feeling left behind and are feeling like they can't trust any of their leaders out there. So what kind of leadership will it take for us to get out of here and actually solve these challenges? Because the interesting thing is that there are solutions to all of our problems, including in climate. Solutions exist, but they are, there's a lack of will. There's a lack of connection, I think, between what we know in our head and what we commit to in our hearts. There are also solutions where we can make sure that people share more fairly in the profits that are made in this world, because the levels of inequality, they're simply unsustainable. And there are lots of ways that we could start working together to try to build more trust in this world, because without that, we're not going to be able to tackle it. We're not going to be able to be successful at any of these challenges if we can't build trust. So we are calling for a new formula for leaders to embrace. We think that leaders now must embrace a moral compass. To us, that is a combination of having a social purpose, which is not profit, but actually something that is compelling to consumers and employees and the talent out there. But we think it's not enough to talk about purpose. We've heard a lot of purpose talk lately. As a matter of fact, purpose is so mainstream that even in Davos, that it probably is not at the cutting edge of changing the world the way it probably should be. We heard most people talking about the need for purpose. Many leaders from all sectors are talking about that. But what we feel has been lacking in that conversation is to call on leaders to embrace a set of principles along with purpose. Because if you have a compelling social purpose, let's take Uber as an example. I believe they were founded around a compelling social purpose. But what went wrong on their journey, and I think Dara, the current CEO, is trying to solve, is that they didn't really embrace a set of principles, and they ended up with a toxic culture and quite many challenges in their leadership and in their company that they continue to face with not having embraced a set of principles. And we believe that those principles need to be holistic. And the B principles we have put down for our leaders as the vision for how we want to lead is we want to embrace sustainability, equality, and accountability in equal balance. They all matter. So we don't think it's enough anymore to lead on climate if you don't also think about how do we make this green transition, this transition to a clean economy, just for those who are now feeling left behind. And that's where equality comes in. Or when we are working in the less developed parts of the world and we start building clean infrastructure, how do we make sure that we do that without corruption so that there is trust and actually true economic growth and job creation happening at home? There's lots of issues that we're dealing with today that actually rest upon the need that we lead that holistically, that we think through and hold ourselves accountable for the wholeness of the outcome of our leadership and how we do business. So moral compass is, in our opinion, the half of the formula of sort of what kind of leadership we need today. The other half is really comes down to the personal characteristics of embracing courage and humility in balance. Courage is in short supply, as I discovered when Paul Polman said he was going to lead for the long term, and I thought everyone else was going to follow, but very few did. Because it does take a lot of courage to go against the crisis of conformity and just continue to do things the way we always have. Paul has shared openly that he decided to make that announcement very early on after his appointment because no board wants to fire a CEO who has just been hired. And I think that's an astute leadership on his behalf. But in many ways, if more leaders sort of stepped out and said, we need to lead for the long term, we need to start governing our companies differently, and we need to start measuring what matters, I really do believe that investors, CEOs, and the community at large will agree with that vision, because I think we're all searching for a new and better vision and a new and better social contract. But it's not enough to have courage. Because we need bold and brave solutions here and we really need to radically rethink pretty much everything we do, because most of our systems are struggling. But we also need humility, because no actor is going to get there alone. If we think about the climate crisis, for example, we are going to need collaboration between private sector, between government and civil society. We need to work with the labor unions to guarantee that it's a just transition. Leadership really today, we need to realize that no one can go it alone anymore. We need to collaborate in much more bold and brave fashion than we have done before. And I sometimes say that courage without humility is very easily perceived as arrogance from the elite by people who are feeling disillusioned in the current system. But humility without courage is not going to get us the solutions we need. So I think it's incredibly important that there is this balance of courage and humility when we try to lead and confront the crisis of conformity. Now, I have full faith that we can do that, and I have that faith because I've seen some incredible leaders set the tone. Paul Polman is certainly one of them, and the financial performance of Unilever during his 10-year tenure speaks volumes about that this kind of leadership actually works. It works for everyone. He's the #1 employer, chosen again and again. He's returned the shareholder returns that everyone is incredibly impressed with. He's experienced more growth from the B corporations that he's been buying as Unilever has been growing that responsible side of its business. So there's absolutely no doubt that this is good for the bottom line, but it's also the right thing to do, and it's also risky not to do this today because companies are increasingly going to be facing if they don't. Another example that is maybe not as well known, but many of you may know, is the example of Emmanuel Faber, the CEO of Danone, the largest yogurt maker in the world and food company. Emmanuel said 10 years ago that we were facing a crisis. We would face a food revolution, and that he would need to start sourcing food and distributing it locally because people were going to want to eat like that. And Danone is on the track to be an outstanding sustainability leader, not just for themselves, but also they are working with their entire supply chain to transform how they do things. So Emmanuel is incredibly committed to sustainability, but he's also committed to justice and equality. So he takes great, like, for example, he's so committed to gender equality that when he took over as CEO after being at the company for many years, he immediately made his executive team gender balanced. He immediately gave women and men the same rights to paternity and maternity leave. So he walks the talk, and he doesn't just talk about it. But what is most impressive, I think, about Emmanuel and Danone is that he holds his feet to the fire. He makes himself so accountable to this bigger definition of success that he turned the North American operation of Danone into a B Corp, basically setting objective and measuring that triple bottom line since 2018. And he set a target to make well, let me back up. That is now the largest B corporation in the world. And he's made a target to turn the entire Danone listed company into a B corporation before 2030 because he's committed to deliver on the sustainable developmental goals. So I think these kind of examples give me a lot of hope, but I think there are also other examples of leadership that is bold and brave, purpose-driven and principled, that are maybe less obvious, not the CEOs of big companies or even the smaller to medium-sized B corporations. And that's people like Greta Thunberg. I don't know how many people of you know her, but she's a 16-year-old Swedish girl who got to speak to heads of state at the last climate summit and to every leader she wanted to in Davos. And I had the wonderful opportunity to do a talk alongside her and Christiana Figueres at the Arctic Base Camp in Davos. And Greta, who has Asperger, started to study the science on climate. And she basically became so disillusioned with our lack of leadership in leading against this greatest crisis of our times that she started to go on a strike and sat outside of the parliament in Sweden with a sign that she was on a school strike for climate. And now she has started a movement that counts hundreds and thousands of students around the world. And I can just see that this movement is not going away. Now, it's pretty sad that it takes the next generation to wake us up to the crisis of conformity. But I have to say that I have great faith that this movement is going to wake us up, because when we take a quick look at the future through the eyes of our children or even grandchildren, I do think that something wakes up inside of us and makes us want to do better. And I absolutely know that we can. So I don't think I want to make this much longer now, because I really like questions and I think it becomes more dynamic, and I'm hoping you have some questions for me, and I know Sanjeev does if you guys don't. So, so I'm pretty sure of that. But I hope this has given you a bit of an idea what the B team is, what the vision we have, how clear-eyed we see the world and how troubled we think we are, and how we think there is a way to confront the crisis of conformity with leadership. And we believe we need to embrace both courage and accountability to do it. And we need to get started now, because we're running out of time on most of these issues.
Thank you so much, Halla, for this sort of tour de force and in perfect T-Bird style. It was incredibly powerful, but also very clear and cogent and action-oriented. We already have a hand raised with Sarah. I'm going to come to her in a second. I just want to announce to everyone that in addition to our growing partnership with Halla and the B team, we just announced yesterday, some of you might know, that Thunderbird and ASU will be the institutional partner, academic partner of the US network of the UN Global Compact. Again, something that Halla helped us win. And so we see very much our role to continue to be to advance the principles and purpose that Halla has been sharing with respect to the B team in multiple ways. So let me go over to Sarah. Sarah, do you want to jump in? We're going to allow you to talk and ask a question or make a comment.
Great.
Sarah, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. My question is, what advice would you give people who are in large organizations where this mindset might not be pervasive, and how we can start to take some actions or introduce these concepts to our peers?
Yeah, great question, Sarah, and a very worthy one. I'm not sure I can give you a complete answer, but what I really believe in is storytelling. And so one of the things, and Sanjeev didn't go into this, but we're in early stages, we're actually looking at how do we start capturing these stories of the courageous leaders out there who are doing it sort of in a better way, and how do we wrap that into kind of a new executive education program with Thunderbird and some other great schools in the world, because we think some people need simply to go and get re-education. But I am actually personally a firm believer in this transformation that is needed in the world, starting at home. Basically, I believe that first you need to work on yourself. And so I'm a big believer in and a proponent of people starting by coming up with their own purpose and principles, and really encouraging leaders. And you don't have to be the CEO to embrace this, or even in the boardroom. As you heard before, the boardroom is quite conformist still, with 40% not even believing climate belongs there. So you may not be able to convince those at the top just yet. But I believe leadership can come from anywhere right now, and look at those school children and find inspiration in that. And so I encourage people who are sort of on this path and see the challenges we're confronted with, and see the need to lead differently, to start building, I tentatively call them B circles, just because, and I have not developed the toolkit to support them, but I hope to have that before too long. But to ask people to start forming communities of courage. Because one of the things I've learned from the B team is that when individual courage is in big demand but short supply, but when individual courage comes together, like we do on the B team, their collective courage becomes even greater. And I really believe that if you build a community of courage around you, it's hard to be courageous, because there's always going to be fear in courage. I know that from my own journey of, for example, deciding to run for president. I was so fearful that, there was a lot of fear in that courage to decide to do that. But if you have the right community around you, you get support, and you're more likely to stay bold, to stay brave. So I would just say, start by finding like-minded people within the organization, even if the CEO or the boardroom doesn't seem to be buying it, and go make the case. And I want to use an example from one of our B team leaders, Mark Benioff. 2 women inside of his company thought there was a gender pay gap. Mark did not believe so. They came to him and told him that if he would support them if they went and looked to it and provided the data. And he said, of course I will. And they showed him the data, and he saw a gender pay gap, and he corrected it very quickly. And he did it because most leaders want to do the right thing for their people. So I see employees as a very powerful lever, or sort of group of change catalysts in this world. And maybe more change will come from employees putting pressures on their leadership than the leadership always waking up voluntarily early enough. So I really encourage, but to me it starts by kind of creating that community, sitting down and figuring out what do I think I'm here to do? What is my purpose? What are my principles? And kind of how do I become clear on my own GPS? And when you have that clarity of what you are there to do, it becomes so much easier to be courageous and to go out there and really sell a new transformative vision inside of your organization. I don't believe you have to be in the positions of the highest power to do so. Look at Greta. I just mentioned her. I look at the Parkland students in the US who took such a strong stand finally on gun control in the US. So, I mean, there are many, many examples of power, new power, I would like to call it, that influences old power. And I really don't think anyone should just say it's okay that my company isn't doing the right thing. We should collectively raise our voices.
Thank you. That was great.
Building on Sarah's question, Bill Bensel asked, what's the call to action? Is there a next step? And it sort of builds on Sarah's question. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Halla?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a great. I think the call to action I have for every individual on this call is I have a call for action for Thunderbird, and Sanjeev answered that very quickly. And we're already working, although still in early stages, on creating a educational program where we hope to really re-educate how we think about what leadership means in this world we live in today, because we think many people will need that. But we also at the B team are trying to think through, and we don't have the answers to that yet, how we could possibly provide support to the many leaders all over the world who want to do this, because we're a team of 28 people who have supported each other, and we're catalyzing this transformation, but we haven't quite figured out how we cascade that vision, that way of doing business and leading beyond the inspirational piece that I think many of the stories of our leaders already do. But I think we need to start thinking more on the hows. So one of the projects I'm engaged with now is I've been spending a lot of time with different groups of people who are trying to tackle what does this new system that we're all saying we need look like? And how do we help? Because there's a system change that needs to happen. And let me give you a very good example here of a conversation I recently had with a CEO who said to me, I want to do this. I agree with you that we are facing these crises of the existential climate crisis, the crisis of equality, the crisis of trust. And I'm frankly at loss as to how to tackle them. And I think the formula you're proposing is right. But listen, I have a conformist boardroom that doesn't support me in going down this path. And I have, and this is directly quoting him, a permafrost of executives. Basically, top layers of executives who want to continue to do business the way it always has been done. Because it takes it takes a lot of courage to go against the system that is so entrenched. And what they all point to is things like the market measures short-term performance only. The governance model we're using is only thinking about and protecting, and the laws are actually asking them only to protect shareholders. What we measure is only financial, and what we incentivize people on is only financial. So I think one call is we need to change education, and we'll start with hopefully a pilot that we hope to influence business schools. Then we need to start changing the definition of success in parallel, because we need to come up with a way for organizations that want to lead in the right way that the world needs right now to be able to do so, to be able to lead for the long term, to be able to measure a bigger bottom line, and to be able to start introducing governance models that allows more voices around the table than just the shareholder's voice. So that's sort of a second piece of what I think is very important to work on. And the B team is working with many different groups on trying to tackle that question now. And I'm not sure that we're going to have one answer. I think there may actually be a menu of ways you can do this. But I do think if you want to be a good leader, you should start embracing a bigger bottom line than just the financial profit. You should really start thinking about, how am I doing on climate? Am I a climate leader or not? How am I doing when it comes to the social contract or the social fabric? Am I providing equal opportunities and fair opportunities, not just inside my company, but also beyond in my supply chain and in my communities? And what am I doing to hold myself accountable to higher standards? I think that's what we need to really start doing. And I think the last thing I would say that the B team hasn't figured out, and I'll be very humble about that fact, but we're having many conversations about it, is how do we help people with the tools that they may need, but more importantly, the emotional support that I believe communities need if they're gonna take on this challenge that, well, and I don't want to say if, because we just have to do this. We have to get this done. We have to deliver the sustainable developmental goals, and we have to bend the emission curve. We have to do this work, and we have to get it done in the next decade or so. So it's an urgent call to action for each one of us to ask, what am I doing? Wherever I am leading, what am I doing? How am I leading? To ask you to think, where is my community of courage? Who am I bringing along on this journey? And where can I contribute to changing the definition of success? Because this one has left us with a burning planet, with social unrest that is not sustainable, and with the lowest trust levels we've ever experienced in modern society.
Halla, we have a question from Diego Osuna, who says, is there something about European leadership style that makes this type of business transformation more likely than the US style of leadership?
Fantastic question. When people, I'll be honest, when I moved from, so I've lived in the US for 10 years back after Thunderbird, and I've lived in the UK and Copenhagen and the Nordics. And I was asked by many people when I moved back to the US, why would you move back to the US? It seems like everything is falling apart in this country now. Many of my friends said that, so I'm not saying that I feel that way, but certainly challenges. And I told them then, and I will say it, that on this call, that I think the US could do with some Nordic values, and maybe I should say the world could do with some Nordic values. I think there is something to the fact that in the Nordic area, and maybe even across Europe, that sort of holistic leadership, that you are there to certainly make money, but also to take care of your people, your community, and to make sure that your business is run within the planetary boundaries, seems to be closer to the values that we have embraced. And that the shareholder supremacy notion, the Milton Friedman kind of what he taught us, is more at the heart of the US world. I think it's fair to say that. But having said that, I don't think that it matters where you live when it comes to these crises that I'm talking about. There is no future beyond planetary boundaries, whether we're in Europe, the US, China, South America, Africa. There is no future beyond planetary boundaries. So there's no business or profit to be made then. There is no market for talent or for your products or for your business if you don't respect fairness and justice and human rights and civic rights in society. We have so much evidence that where we have low levels of civic rights or human rights, business does so much worse than where we have high levels of that. And there is absolutely, we're not going to be able to continue to do business without trust. And the only way I know how to build that is through more transparency and responsibility in leadership. It's not just about courage right now. It's about holding ourselves accountable to higher standards. And you know what, you may think that sounds futuristic, and I actually might have thought that at some point too, but it is already the expectation. We are already seeing consumer talent changing their behavior as to where they want to work and where they will do business based on how accountable they see you as a company and as a leader. And we are increasingly seeing capital think in that way. There's been a bigger move of capital into impact investing or ESG investing or responsible or sustainable investing than ever before lately. And it's really picking up volume. Not enough, we need a lot more, but it is picking up volume. And even Larry Fink is talking about purpose. I would like to see BlackRock also put more money behind that. But this is happening. And when the transfer of wealth that's ahead of us happens, where women and the younger generations of people will hold so much more wealth than they ever have before, this will really be a transformative power. So I think, I don't think it matters where you are. You are going to have to lead in this way if you want to be around in the 21st century. And I feel like I left something out. That's maybe because Sanjeev and Thunderbird is doing such a good job at that. But of course, we're also in the midst of facing this digital disruption, this fourth industrial revolution. And that is going to fuel some of these challenges. It offers some solutions to some of these challenges I'm talking about, but it's going to fuel anger in the street. And it's going to continue to provide us with challenges in our democratic societies the world over. And I don't see a difference, for example, between US and Europe or Latin America, for that matter, when it comes to some of the behaviors we're seeing in our democracies because of the perceived or real injustice and inequality that the broken Friedman system has created.
So we are looking for some more questions. I don't see any at this point. I'm going to give everyone a minute and maybe ask you, oh, Peter Hill raised his hand. Peter, please join us. Go ahead, Peter, try again. I think we just unmuted you. Are you there, Peter?
Technology.
Can you hear me now?
I think you're on now, Peter. Try again.
Okay. Now, how can a big company in a competitive industry really take into consideration environmental and social considerations without having shareholder value suffer and therefore management running the risk of being thrown out?
That's a really good question, Peter. And I will tell you that I think there are three different arguments, I think, that one can put forward while the system change hasn't happened. And the first one I would say is the risk argument. I don't know if you are aware of, but about 30% of assets are already uninsurable because of climate change. So I don't know what boardroom with all the things we got going on in climate thinks that we don't need to talk about climate, but this is just, it's risky not to. It is relevant for every business. So the risk sort of, and the same thing in terms of the social fabric. If you are not doing the right thing there, then you are going to struggle with attracting talent. You are going to struggle with attracting customers. This is not just a nice to do. It's risky not to do it because it has become the expectation and will increasingly be the expectation. The second sort of related argument is the business case. And the business case is pretty good. And if you look at the stories from, there's not enough of them, but Paul Polman or Emmanuel, and we really have, and Mark Benioff, how he's leading Salesforce and how he becomes #1 employer for talent when he speaks up on social issues. And that's actually been why he's built trust and why people want to work there and why people want to partner with that company and why people want to invest in that company. So I think there is a risk case and there's a business case. But I personally believe the moral case is the most compelling one. But I realize that not everyone starts there. So in my opinion, this is not, but the difficulty is, I think, when you're arguing for either the risk or the business case is, well, if we do it and others don't, then we're going to lose our competitive advantage. My answer to that is, I think we should do more of what, for example, Chobani and Danone were able to do when they joined the B team. They lifted themselves above the everyday competition and said that they would collaborate in talking about some of these great big challenges that affect all of us. Paul Polman did similar things when he reached out and worked with Pepsi and a few other companies in the consumer product space, companies that normally wouldn't work together, but they all agreed that there was an objective about having cleaner clean energy coolers for some of their products around the world, and they work together on that. So, one, I don't think this is going to make you less competitive. It is going to make you more competitive. Two, I think collaboration in terms of tackling these great big challenges that don't have to do with our everyday competition, but are challenges that confront all of us. And I think we need to collaborate more. I hope we will see the day when Silicon Valley comes together and uses its talent and treasures to solve some of these great big challenges, because they certainly have the talent to do it. So yeah, I'm going to make the case. But short term, I know that good CEOs have lost their roles for doing the right thing. I can name one from the B team, David Crane, who was the CEO of NRG. He actually lost his job on the way to Paris, where he was with the B team to advocate for the Paris Agreement, because he had betted too much in the eyes of his shareholders on solar panels. But the company's history since, I think, speaks volumes about David having been on the right track, but the shareholders being too short-sighted. So I think there will be some casualties when people are courageous, but I think this is what the world needs from us right now. We have to be brave enough to do the right thing, even if it may cost us something. But if we could do it together, it will be easier. And one of the things I'm working on these days is trying to get a group of CEOs to kind of step up together and speak very boldly about how shareholders and investors need to let us lead for the long term and need to let us practice governance that is considerate of all stakeholders and needs to ask us and start valuing the triple bottom line or the ESG performance alongside the profit. So I don't think you have to give up the profit, but I think you will give up the profit just in a few years' time if you don't do the right thing in terms of sustainability, equality, and accountability. You won't be around.
Tammy's asking, she says, I love these ideas, but I struggle to see how things can change in my industry, banking in Germany, when survival is the primary goal and the company leaders pawns of political whims that, in my opinion, will only destroy value. Employees are unmotivated, sometimes apathetic, and fearful of making waves and losing their jobs. Do you have any thoughts? Thank you for your very motivational talk.
No, thank you for listening. And I know I'm probably a bit of a radical, and having come from finance, I understand knowing Germany quite well. I understand your frustration, but I want to give you inspiration because it's probably the best answer I can give you. One of our B team leaders, the CEO of Allianz, which is a German company, a global company, but he is certainly in Munich, is in the financial services industry. And he told me quite a remarkable story in Davos, actually, just this January, a story that has resonated with me because Allianz does better than most, if not all, financial services companies that I've come across. And Oliver is a very bold and brave leader. And I asked him, where does that come from? Why do you do what you do? And he, of course, gave me lots of good evidence for that because Oliver's a smart guy and he sees that we have to do these things. But he did give me a personal story. And personal story was that his daughter asked him one day, a few years ago, Daddy, are you proud of every product you sell? And that led to a transformation in his way of thinking. And Allianz has now divested from coal and doesn't insure fossil fuel anymore and has a separate ESG board that takes a look at their environmental, social, and governance data, uses a lot of data that's available out there, and actually regularly invites the children of those board directors to come into their meetings to ask them questions. So they hold themselves accountable to the next generation. Now, that's a global financial services company located in Germany. I understand your frustration because I've seen plenty of it, and I didn't find financial services particularly nourishing environment, but I think this can be done. And there are a lot of companies moving in this direction. MasterCard is another company that comes to mind that's really been thinking about inclusive values, cultures, inclusive economies, and working on that, putting a lot of its resources towards it. So I would say, be the change that needs to happen inside of your organization, not alone. Build a community of people, start studying these inspirational practices, start embracing a bolder and braver vision, because we have to. The conformity is no longer an option. It's going to lead us down a path that none of us are going to be able to live with. But we can do this, but it's going to take people rising to that leadership, and it's not always going to come from the top. And I even if I spend a lot of time speaking to board directors these days, I'm afraid that very few boardrooms are going to call for the transformation needed. Just by design, they are unfortunately too shareholder focused and too focused on squeezing up profit for the short term. But those companies are not going to survive, not long term.
I don't see any more questions at this point. But except for Bill's suggestion, ask a question about, are we leveraging the worldwide reach of ASU into this B team focus? And I want to say, Bill, at Thunderbird and ASU more generally, absolutely. Just this past week, in addition to the announcement of the UN Global Compact USA Network hosting, we hosted Green Biz, which is actually still going on, the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, a GRI training, and we're doing that not only here in Arizona, but all around the world. And precisely the partnership with Halla and the B team is to support her and the B team in this worldwide movement. Mm-hmm. As she said in her opening remarks, T-Birds have always had this ethical core as part of who we are, and now we're just doubling and tripling our efforts and bringing all of ASU's sort of vast resources behind it as well. Halla, I'm going to come to you. If there's something that just came on, but I'm going to, because we're at the end of our time right now, and just ask Halla if you have any final comments before we close up.
there's so many thoughts that go through, and one I would just want to say is that I chose Thunderbird very deliberately because of its three-part model that really appealed to me. It was part business, it was part how do we sort of live in this world of globalized, multilateral kind of collaboration world, and it was part being able to communicate cross cultures and know languages and sort of understand people. The really, I think in the Thunderbird DNA is built this very vision that I think most of the movements I'm observing around the world are coming around to, and that is that whatever we call it, it doesn't really matter what we call the standard or the measurement, but that it is time to realize that Friedman is dead, and there is a new system that we need to start uniting behind, and there's already a movement towards, and that system is going to transform the definition of success from being in corporations only financial profits, in nations only GDP, to becoming more holistic and consider people and planet alongside the monetary factors. Whether we call it social progress and for the nation state, which is actually a measurement that's quite taken off and is quite successful, or national happiness in Bhutan, or whether we call it in business ESG, triple bottom line, or purpose plus principles. It doesn't really matter what name we give it, but this is inevitable and needs to happen. And the question I have for each and every one of you is maybe a little corny, but on which side of history are you going to be? Because this is happening, and hopefully in time where we can take pride in having taken on the greatest challenge in our lifetime, which is really to create a sustainable way of doing business and living together in this world in a decade. That's a big ask.
Well, it's the right ask. And thank you so much, Halla, for taking time. All of our T-Birds around the world that have joined virtually. We'll have our next event, webinar, next month, as we discussed and Dawn mentioned. We'll make sure that that invite gets out. We'll have the link up very shortly. Please forward it around to other T-Birds. Make sure they know we're doing this every month. Make suggestions on who else we should bring in to give these excellent webinars, and also different formats that we can put together and assemble. I just want to just end by saying that at Thunderbird now, as always, we're fully committed to this magical triangle that Halla reminded of us that we've always had: global business skills, leadership skills, international political economy and globalization, culture and languages. But to that, we are making more explicit something that's always been very implicit: a focus on the technology and the digital transformation, and a focus on sustainability, accountability, and trust. And so really everything we're doing, if you look at our new curriculum that we've just finished completing for the MGM, to our executive education programs, the partnerships we're building, to engaging all of you, is to move in this direction. So thank you all. Please make sure to spread the word that Thunderbird is out there in the world making change with great leaders like Halla and all of yourselves. Till next time, all my best. Thank you, Halla.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
That's great.